Welcome everyone, go ahead and take your seats. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome the class to today's focused legal masterclass. We're doing a deep dive today, a really rigorous, authoritative, but totally fascinating exploration into one of the most interesting corners of succession law. We're looking at exceptions to the rule, informal and privileged wills under Zambian law. So grab those notebooks because we're going to unpack exactly what happens when the incredibly rigid structures of the law just straight up collide with the extreme, messy realities of human survival.
All right, here's our syllabus for today's lecture. 1. Exceptions to the rule. 2. Who qualifies for privilege. 3. The terminally ill testator. 4. Executing an informal will. And finally, 5. Revoking a privileged will. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Exceptions to the rule. Life, death, and the law.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Generally speaking, the law absolutely loves its rigid paperwork. I mean, it demands formal execution, strict signatures, multiple witnesses, all to protect against fraud, right? But ask yourself, what happens to the strict rules of Section 6, subsection 1 of the Zambian Wills Act, when death is literally imminent and writing is totally impossible? Imagine you're pinned down on a battlefield, or, say, trapped after a massive accident. Writing a formal legal document is completely out of the question. Does the law just shrug and ignore your final wishes? Not at all. See, the law answers this massive dilemma with something called a privileged will. Now, a privileged will is basically defined as an informal will made without the strict formal execution requirements of Section 6.1 of the Wills Act. It's grounded in the statutory authority of Section 6.4. And this doctrine essentially says, look, in highly specific, literal life-or-death situations, we are going to entirely waive the standard procedural hoops.
Section 2. Who qualifies for privilege?
So the absolute crucial point here is figuring out exactly who gets a pass on these formalities. Because believe me, the law doesn't just hand this exception out to anyone who feels a bit rushed. It actually deems 3 very specific, exclusive categories of people worthy of bypassing the standard rules. First up, members of the defense forces on active service. And here's a really critical legal detail. Active service legally begins the absolute precise moment deployment orders for imminent war are received. Second, members of the security forces engaged on security operations. That means maneuvers that are actively endangering their lives. And third, terminally ill or physically injured persons. Now we're going to get to that third one in just a moment, but first, I really want to highlight something wild about those soldiers.
Take a look at the age anomaly. Under standard Zambia law, Section 4 of the Wills Act strictly states that no will made by a minor, so anyone under 18, is valid. Period. But an informal, privileged will can actually be legally made by a minor. So think about this practical scenario. A 17-year-old soldier receives combat deployment orders for imminent war. Legally, they can't even buy a house or sign a basic cell phone contract. But under the privilege of Section 6.4, that 17-year-old can absolutely dictate their final wishes, distribute their assets, and the law will enforce it 100%. It's a shocking, yet honestly deeply practical legal anomaly.
Section 3. The terminally ill testator. All right, let's shift the focus of our masterclass away from the chaotic, dusty battlefield and move into the much more solemn, quiet setting of a hospital deathbed. Here, we see a really stark contrast. A standard testator, they've got to jump through all the formal legal hoops. But for a sick or injured person to actually qualify as a privileged testator, the law requires 3 incredibly strict medical and mental conditions to be met all at the exact same time. First, they must have a settled or hopeless expectation of death. Second, they must have totally abandoned all hope of recovery. And third, and this one is absolutely vital, they must actually die due to that specific illness or physical injury. Because if a patient dictates a privileged will, but then, miraculously goes into remission and just goes home, well, the legal context totally shifts, and that privilege may be heavily scrutinized later.
Section 4. Executing an informal will.
Okay, so we know the who and the when, but let's move on to the actual procedural mechanics. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how these informal instruments are actually executed when the clock is ticking down and time is running out. The law provides some incredible flexibility here through 3 highly specific methods. Method 1, it can be written and entirely unattested, meaning no witnesses, provided the material provisions and the signature are literally in the testator's own handwriting. Method 2, it can be written, maybe by someone else on their behalf, but it must be attested by just one witness instead of the standard 2. And Method 3, it can be entirely oral, literally just spoken aloud in front of 2 witnesses, no paper required whatsoever.
But that begs the question, just how formal does the language actually need to be? Well, consider this legal precedent from the famous Estate of Beaches case. Quote, "The testator must intend deliberately to give expression to his wishes. He does not need to know that he is making a will. Guys, this is incredibly powerful. A dying person simply expressing their final wishes to their comrades or to family members operates as a completely valid legal will. They don't need to know any fancy legal jargon. They don't even need to be aware of the Wills Act. They just need the deliberate intention to state what should happen to their property after they die. That's it.
Section 5. Revoking a privileged will.
So, for the final act of today's lecture, let's look at how these powerful, informal instruments can actually be undone once they're spoken or scribbled down. Now, generally the rules of revocation mirror formal wills. The acceptable methods are physical destruction by the testator with the active intention to revoke, making a duly executed later will or codicil, or producing a writing that formally declares an intention to revoke. However, because of the totally unique nature of informal wills, we run into a really fascinating logistical problem here.
And this brilliantly illustrates the quirks of the law, the oral exception. You see, an oral will cannot be revoked by physical destruction, which, if you think about it for a second, makes perfect logical sense. I mean, you simply cannot physically tear up, burn, or shred words that were spoken out into the air to your comrades on a battlefield. It's physically impossible. You'd have to use another method, like actually creating a later will.
Now, let's look at the sheer legal weight these informal wills carry. Section 13, subsection 3 of the Zambian Wills Act reveals an unbelievable power. Get this. An informal, privileged will can actually be used to legally revoke an earlier, strictly drafted formal will. Really think about that. You could have paid a lawyer thousands of kwacha to draft a beautifully bound, perfectly witnessed formal document. But if you are later deployed to a war zone and you dictate a new oral will to two fellow soldiers, that literal battlefield whisper completely overrides and revokes all the expensive formal paperwork. It's wild.
Finally, let's clarify a very common misconception about lasting power. What happens if the soldier survives the war, or the terminally ill patient goes into permanent remission? Do they just automatically lose their privileged will? Actually, no. Surviving the extreme circumstance does not automatically cancel the privileged will. The instrument remains legally binding and totally valid until it is actively revoked by the testator. So a will quickly scribbled on a rationing box in a muddy trench? Yeah, that can absolutely govern in the state 50 years later if it's never formally revoked.
Which brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. If a 17-year-old soldier can dictate a perfectly valid oral will in the chaotic heat of battle, and the legal system completely respects and enforces it, is our everyday rigid obsession with formal signatures, double witnesses, and complex legal paperwork truly protecting us, or is it just slowing us down? Think about that as you review your notes. Class dismissed.